The Korean War is often called the Forgotten War, a brutal conflict sandwiched between the global scale of World War II and the ideological trauma of Vietnam. By late 1951, the fluid movements of the early war had ground to a halt, replaced by a grueling, static war of attrition reminiscent of the trenches of World War I. Across the 38th parallel, the landscape was a jagged spine of granite peaks and deep valleys, where every ridge was a fortress and every hill was a graveyard. Amidst this vertical wilderness sat a position of supreme strategic importance. Maryang San, known to the Allies as Hill 317, Maryang San was not just a hill, it was the eagle's nest of the sector. Rising sharply above the surrounding terrain, it offered whoever held its summit a panoramic view of the entire valley, controlling the vital supply routes and overlooking the Allied lines for miles in every direction. It was a natural citadel, fortified by the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, PVA, with a sophisticated network of deep bunkers, interconnected tunnels, and heavy machine gun nests. To the American forces who had previously attempted to storm its heights, Maryang San was a death trap. Every assault had been repelled by a hail of lead and steel, leaving the slopes littered with the wreckage of failed ambitions. The task of breaking this stalemate fell to the 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, 3RAR. The Australians were veteran diggers, men who had already proven their mettle at Kapyong, but Maryang San presented a challenge of a different order. They were ordered to launch a direct assault on a position that was deemed impregnable. The Allied High Command viewed the mission as a necessary sacrifice to straighten the line, but for the men of 3RAR, it was an invitation to do the impossible. As the soldiers of the 3rd Battalion gathered at the base of the massif, they looked up at a summit shrouded in a haunting, permanent mist. They were not just facing an entrenched and determined enemy. They were facing a psychological barrier. The mountain loomed over them, a silent witness to previous failures, its steep, rain-slicked slopes promising only exhaustion and death. Yet under the leadership of Lieutenant Colonel Frank Hassett, the Australians were not preparing for a blind charge. They were preparing to disappear into the fog and become the ghosts of the mountain. Part 1 sets the stage for a confrontation where traditional military doctrine would be discarded in favor of sheer audacity. The forgotten battlefield of Maryang San was about to witness a feat of arms so extraordinary that it would eventually be taught in military academies for decades. The stage was set, the mountain was waiting, and the few hundred men of 3RAR were about to step into a firestorm that would write their names in blood across the peaks of Korea. To understand the sheer madness of the mission at Maryang San, one must look at the staggering numbers on the chalkboard. Perched atop the jagged ridges of Hill 317 was a force of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, PVA, that was not merely entrenched. They were an apex predator in their natural habitat. Facing the few hundred men of the 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, 3RAR, was an enemy force of divisional strength, numbering upwards of 5,000 veteran soldiers. This was a suicide mission by the numbers. A 1-to-10 ratio where the attackers had to climb vertically while the defenders sat comfortably behind reinforced steel and timber. The Chinese had transformed Maryang San into a vertical fortress. Their defense was built on a honeycomb system, interconnected tunnels dug deep into the mountain's reverse slopes, protecting them from even the heaviest Allied naval and air bombardment. They possessed absolute height advantage, meaning every meter of the Australian advance was mapped out in the crosshairs of Chinese heavy machine guns and mortars. The slopes were not just steep, they were a labyrinth of interlocking fields of fire where a single mistake would result in an entire platoon being wiped out in seconds. Adding to the terror was the environment itself, a place the soldiers began to call the White Zone of Death. Late 1951 brought a bone-chilling cold that seeped into the marrow of the bone. The mountain was constantly draped in a thick, wet mist, and a freezing drizzle that turned the narrow rocky trails into slick slides of mud and ice. To climb was to crawl was to be exposed. Visibility was often reduced to a few meters, creating a claustrophobic hell where an enemy could be standing right in front of you, bayonet ready before you even saw a shadow. The Chinese were masters of this white zone. They were disciplined, invisible, and possessed a fanatical resolve to hold the high ground at any cost. They utilized human wave tactics for counterattacks, but their defensive posture was one of surgical precision. They had mapped every ridge and every outcrop, For any conventional military force, Maryang San was an objective to be bypassed or leveled from the air, but never taken by infantry. To the Australians looking up from the valley floor, the enemy truly seemed to be in the sky. They weren't just fighting men, they were fighting the very laws of physics and the cruelty of the Korean winter. No one in the Allied command truly believed that a few hundred diggers could dislodge a 5,000-man division from such a stronghold. The stage was set for a massacre, but the Australians were about to prove that when the terrain is impossible and the odds are suicidal, the only way to win is to become more dangerous than the mountain itself. In the face of suicidal odds, Lieutenant Colonel Frank Hassett, the commander of 3RAR, knew that a standard frontal assault would lead to nothing but a mountain of Australian corpses. Military doctrine suggested that an uphill battle against a 10-to-1 force was impossible, but Hassett was a thinker, a tactical innovator who realized that the very environment intended to kill his men could, if used correctly, become their greatest shield. He devised a plan that was as much a psychological gambit as it was a military maneuver. He would use the white zone of death to mask a vertical infiltration. The masterstroke of Hassett's plan was the exploitation of the thick, heavy mist. While the Chinese relied on the fog to hide their bunkers, Hassett used it to hide his entire battalion's movement. He ordered his men to scale the eastern and northern ridges, slopes so steep and jagged that the Chinese commanders had deemed them unclimbable. The logic was simple. The enemy doesn't guard what they believe is impossible to traverse. On the morning of October 5, 1951, under the cover of a pre-dawn darkness and a fog so dense it felt like a physical weight, the Australians began their ascent. They didn't move like a traditional infantry line. They moved like special forces, carrying heavy packs, ammunition, and tools. The diggers literally clawed their way up the granite faces. They bypassed the primary Chinese killing zones, using the mist to slip past sentinel outposts that were mere meters away. The silence was absolute, broken only by the muffled clink of gear and the heavy breathing of men defying gravity. Coordinating with this silent climb was a display of artillery mastery. Hassett worked with the New Zealand 16th Field Regiment to create a creeping barrage. The shells didn't just rain down randomly. They fell with surgical precision just ahead of the advancing infantry, pinning the Chinese inside their deep bunkers. This forced the defenders to stay underground, blinded by the fog and deafened by the shells, while the Australians were scaling the cliffs directly above their heads. The tactic was defined by the mantra, strike fast, dig in deep, hold tight. The goal was to seize a foothold on a series of intermediate peaks, Hill 355 and Hill 217, before surging toward the main summit of Hill 317. By the time the sun began to burn through the fog, the unthinkable had happened. The Chinese lookouts rubbed their eyes to see Australian slouch hats emerging from the precipices they thought were impassable. The ghosts in the mist had arrived on the doorstep of the fortress, and the lightning strike was about to turn into a hurricane of fire. When the morning sun finally burned through the protective shroud of mist, the tactical silence of the infiltration exploded into a cacophony of violence. The ghosts had been revealed, and the Chinese defenders, recovering from their initial shock, unleashed the full fury of a division-strength garrison. What followed was not a clean military engagement, but a descent into a visceral, primordial hell. Maryang San became a meat grinder of close-quarters combat, where the distance between life and death was often the length of a bayonet. The fighting was characterized by its sheer, jagged brutality. In the narrow, zigzagging trenches and the dark mouths of the bunkers, the Australians engaged in desperate hand-to-hand struggles. They used everything at their disposal: Thompson submachine guns, grenades, knives, and when those failed, their bare hands. Every few meters of the ridge had to be bought with blood. The Chinese, known for their fanatical bravery, launched wave after wave of human sea counterattacks, trying to push the diggers back off the precipice they had so painstakingly climbed. But the enemy was not the only threat. The soldiers were trapped in a grueling battle against their own biological limits. By the second and third days, the men of 3RAR were operating in a state of extreme physical and mental exhaustion. They were fighting in a white zone, where the temperature plummeted well below freezing at night, turning sweat-soaked uniforms into suits of icy armor. Sleep was a luxury that did not exist. To close one's eyes was to invite a Chinese grenade or a bayonet from the dark. The physical endurance required was staggering. Between the waves of attacks, the Australians had to dig in deep into the frozen rocky earth. They had to carve out fighting pits while under constant mortar fire, their hands raw and bleeding from the cold and the labor. They acted as their own stretcher bearers, dragging wounded comrades down the same vertical cliffs they had climbed, often under direct fire. There were no reinforcements and no easy way out. The courage of 3RAR during these hours was defined by a quiet, grim resilience. There was no room for grand gestures. There was only the cold necessity of holding the line. Men shared their last scraps of rations and their remaining magazines, huddled in shallow scrapes in the ground as the mountain shook from the impact of thousands of shells. They were dehydrated, starving, and shivering uncontrollably, yet they refused to yield. They had fought their way into the sky, and they were determined to turn Maryang San into an Australian fortress, proving that the human spirit, when pushed to its absolute limit, can survive even the most concentrated fire of hell. After 5 days of unrelenting carnage, the impossible became a reality. On the morning of October 8, 1951, the exhausted men of 3RAR stood atop the jagged summit of Hill 317. The Eagle's Nest had fallen. Against all military logic, a single battalion of a few hundred Australians had systematically dismantled and driven out a force of nearly 5,000 Chinese veterans. The strategic divine eye of the sector was now in Allied hands, and the Chinese divisional command was forced into a chaotic retreat, abandoning a position they had sworn to hold to the last man. The scale of this miracle sent shockwaves through the local command. When the reports reached the Allied HQ, they were met with stunned silence followed by disbelief. To capture Maryang San was one thing. To do it with such a lopsided military force while maintaining the integrity of the battalion was another entirely. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Hassett's masterpiece of artillery-infantry cooperation had worked to perfection. By the time the final ridge was cleared, the Australians had achieved what whole American divisions had struggled to do months prior. This was, without question, the greatest single infantry feat performed by Australian arms in the 20th century. It was a victory won through the Digger ethos, a combination of high-level tactical intelligence and the sheer bloody-minded refusal to quit. The victory at Maryang San effectively neutralized the Chinese threat in that sector for a significant period, saving countless Allied lives by depriving the enemy of their most valuable observation post. However, as the dust and cordite settled over the mountain, a strange and hollow silence followed. In the great theaters of history, Maryang San should have been a household name, yet it became a forgotten victory. While the soldiers were still tending to their wounded on the blood-soaked slopes, the global media was distracted. The Western press was fixated on the fluctuating peace talks at Panmunjom and the larger ideological chess game of the Cold War. The news of a few hundred Australians seizing a hill in Korea was buried under headlines of political maneuvering. The 3RAR had achieved a tactical wow factor that would eventually be studied by military elites worldwide. But at the time, there were no parades. The men stood on the peak, looking out over the valleys they had conquered, weary and battered, but triumphant. They had written a manual on how to win against 10-to-1 odds on the most hostile terrain on Earth. Yet the tragedy of Maryang San was only beginning to unfold. Not on the battlefield, but in the corridors of power where the blood shed on Hill 317 would soon be treated as a mere bargaining chip. Victory on the battlefield is often measured by the ground held and the blood sacrificed to take it. For the men of 3RAR, Maryang San was more than just a geographic coordinate. It was a sacred piece of earth bought with the lives of their friends and the sheer agonizing effort of their own bodies. They had transformed Hill 317 from a Chinese stronghold into an Australian bastion. However, less than a month after their triumph, the soldiers were dealt a blow that hurt more than any Chinese mortar shell. They were ordered to withdraw. The decision came not from a military failure, but from the cold, detached calculations of international politics. As the peace negotiations at Panmunjom ebbed and flowed, the Allied High Command decided to rationalize the front line. To the generals on the map, Maryang San was a salient, a protruding point that required too many resources to defend in a static war. For the sake of a more defensible and straighter line, the order was given to abandon the heights that the Australians had just conquered against 10-to-1 odds. The withdrawal was a heartbreaking scene for the veterans. They were forced to pack their gear and march back down the very cliffs they had scaled in the mist. As they retreated, they watched from the valley floor as the Chinese forces, who had been shattered only weeks before, simply walked back onto the summit without firing a single shot. The eagle's nest was handed back to the enemy on a silver platter of political compromise. To the men of 3RAR, it felt like a betrayal of the highest order. They had performed a miracle only to see it erased by the stroke of a pen in a distant tent. This bitter victory left a lasting scar on the Australian military psyche. For the veterans, the sight of Chinese flags flying once again over Maryang San was a visceral reminder of the futility that can sometimes characterize modern conflict. They had proven their superiority as infantrymen, but they had learned a harsh lesson. In a war of ideologies, the soldier's sacrifice is often secondary to the diplomat's agenda. The mountain that should have been a permanent monument to their courage became, instead, a symbol of a victory that was as fleeting as the morning mist. To this day, Maryang San remains a source of profound short-lived victory for those who were there. It was a masterpiece of tactical execution, followed by a masterpiece of strategic abandonment. The soldiers left the hill behind, but they carried the weight of that loss for the rest of their lives. They had conquered the mountain and the enemy, but they could not conquer the political reality of a war that had no intention of letting them win for long. The triumph and subsequent heartbreak at Maryang San highlighted a specific breed of warrior, the Australian digger of the Royal Australian Regiment. These men were not defined by flashy heroics or a desire for international headlines. They were defined by a grim, understated resilience and a professional standard of infantry craft that was virtually unmatched in the Korean theater. The soldiers of 3RAR represented a quiet excellence, men who could endure the most extreme physical deprivation, navigate the most hostile terrain, and still maintain the tactical discipline required to defeat a force 10 times their size. Central to this spirit was an extraordinary level of discipline under pressure. At Maryang San, this meant the ability to withstand sub-zero temperatures and bone-deep exhaustion without losing the will to fight. While other units might have crumbled under the psychological weight of being surrounded by 5,000 enemy troops, the Australians maintained a steady, professional focus. They fought with a stoic endurance, laboring in the mud and the ice, performing the unsexy work of war, digging, carrying supplies, and maintaining weapons, with as much dedication as they did in the heat of a bayonet charge. This resilience was paired with a unique tactical flexibility. The Australians developed a reputation for being masters of small unit warfare. They didn't rely on massive sweeping maneuvers. Instead, they relied on the initiative of individual corporals and sergeants. On the slopes of Hill 317, this translated into an ability to adapt to a rapidly changing battlefield. When the fog rolled in, they didn't wait for orders. They utilized the cover to reposition. When a bunker proved too strong for a frontal attack, they found a way to scale a cliff and drop grenades from above. This adaptability became the hallmark of the Australian infantrymen. Maryang San also served as the ideal prototype for future Australian special operations and light infantry tactics. The mission proved that a highly trained, well-coordinated battalion could achieve strategic results that usually required an entire division. It emphasized the importance of command at the edge, where the man on the ground is trusted to make the decisive move. This philosophy of being quietly lethal and professionally stubborn became the cornerstone of the Royal Australian Regiment's identity. Ultimately, the soldiers of the RAR at Maryang San proved that the most important weapon on any battlefield is the character of the men who stand upon it. They didn't ask for fame, and they didn't receive much of it, but they left a standard of combat excellence that is still revered today. They were the men who could live in the white zone of death and still come out fighting, proving that while a victory can be taken away by politics, the resilience shown in achieving it belongs to the soldiers forever. The Battle of Maryang San stands as a haunting testament to a fundamental truth in military history. The greatest victories are not always those that result in the permanent acquisition of territory, but those that redefine the limits of human capability. Although the physical heights were eventually surrendered to political compromise, the blood shed on Hill 317 was not in vain. It served to rewrite the manual on modern infantry combat, transforming a localized struggle into a permanent cornerstone of Australian military doctrine. The primary legacy of Maryang San is the perfection of coordinated fire and movement. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Hassett's ability to synchronize the devastating power of artillery with the stealth of mountain climbing infantry became a classic case study. It proved that technology and raw power are useless without the precision and grit of the individual soldier. This battle demonstrated that even against an enemy with a 10-to-1 numerical advantage, superior tactical coordination and the intelligent use of terrain can act as a force multiplier. Today, the Maryang San model is a staple in the Australian Command and Staff College, taught as the gold standard for how to conduct a battalion-level attack on a fortified position. Beyond the tactical manuals, the battle became an enduring symbol of fighting in isolation. The men of 3RAR operated on the jagged edge of the world, cut off by weather, terrain, and overwhelming enemy numbers. Their ability to maintain cohesion and fighting spirit in the face of such crushing odds became the benchmark for the modern Royal Australian Regiment. It taught future generations of soldiers that a unit's true strength is measured when the fog is thickest and the situation is most desperate. The phrase, "when the mountain is high, do not turn back," became more than a slogan. It became an operational reality rooted in the granite of Hill 317. Furthermore, Maryang San established a profound tradition of the quiet professional. Because the victory was largely overlooked by the global press at the time, it fostered a culture within the Australian Army that values results over recognition. It reinforced the digger identity, a soldier who fights with absolute lethality, but carries his achievements with a humble silence. This ethos of quiet resilience is what modern special forces and elite infantry units still strive to emulate today. Ultimately, Maryang San is a story of a victory that survived its own abandonment. While the Chinese may have reoccupied the summit in 1951, the Australian Army occupied the moral high ground forever. It remains a masterclass in tactical brilliance and an immortal monument to the spirit of those who refuse to yield. The legacy of Maryang San is a reminder to every soldier that while a hill can be given away, the honor of having taken it can never be stolen. It is a story written in blood on the mountain, a story of how a few hundred men proved that when courage meets competence, the impossible becomes possible.